There are cases in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes so steeped in dread and whisper that even now I hesitate to set them down. For there are rooms in England where the air itself seems to remember, where dust gathers not by chance, but by command. It was in the dying weeks of winter, when London's fog lay like damp parchment upon the streets, that Holmes and I were summoned, not by the law, but by a scholar who feared the very books he guarded. A library sealed for centuries, a key tied with purple ribbon, a black volume that glittered faintly even in darkness, and two men who had died with that same gold upon their fingers. So began a mystery where learning turned lethal, where reason was tested against superstition, and where a mind as keen as Holmes's would find itself staring into the abyss of the devil's own library. This, then, is the case I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Devil's Library. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Key from Blackmere Priory. It was a quiet morning at Baker Street, the sort of London quiet that is compounded equally of fog and coal smoke, so that the city seems wrapped in a grey blanket, stitched with the muffled sounds of hooves and hawkers. Holmes, in a purple dressing-gown of Eastern silk and a humour of extreme abstraction, had arranged his chemical apparatus across the table in a manner that would have alarmed the most liberal householder. A faint white smoke drifted toward the window, and the violin lay open-mouthed upon the chair, as if it too had been pressed into service and then dismissed for want of the proper key. "Observe, Watson," said he, without looking up from a test tube whose contents had assumed an unpleasant ochre hue. "The difference between caution and cowardice. The first preserves life. The second preserves fear. I lament that London breeds too much of the latter." Before I could engage this aperçu, which I suspected was directed less at chemistry than at the morning's correspondence, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. The gentleman who followed her was tall, thin, with the pallor of a student long estranged from sunlight. His black frock coat was impeccably brushed, yet dust filmed his cuffs, and a faint granular sheen clung to his lapels, as if he had leaned against a thing long undisturbed. His eyes had the restless focus of a man who reads by preference and converses by necessity. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am Jasper Vale, cousin to Sir Lionel Eversley of Blackmere Priory in Kent. I am also, by necessity, the custodian of his library. We require your assistance most urgently." Holmes sank into his armchair and steepled his fingers with that air of feline patience that presages either dismissal or intense interest. "Pray sit, Mr. Vale. Your library, before all else. My colleague here is Dr. Watson, whose discretion equals his medical skill." Vale took the proffered seat with the awkward grace of one more accustomed to library ladders than drawing-rooms. "The collection is famous," said he. 15th century incunabula, forbidden treatises of the Reformation, and, if one credits the traditions of Blackmere, certain manuscripts from the old priory itself, when it was still a house of the Benedictines. The villagers call it the Devil's Library, though my uncle forbade the name. I confess, Mr. Holmes, I am not easily moved by legend. But 2 deaths, I beg you to, have transpired beneath that roof in as many weeks. He spoke then with the compressed urgency of an educated man recounting what he scarcely believes. Mr. Gideon Humber, an elderly librarian lately imported from Oxford to catalogue the collection had been discovered 3 nights before, seated at a desk in the inner library, his head fallen upon an open folio, and his right hand still clenched about the ivory paper knife. The village coroner, a man more familiar with farm accidents than bibliographic calamities, had muttered heart failure and closed the matter. Yesterday morning, Sir Lionel himself had collapsed there, senseless, while inspecting the same room. He lived, but his breathing was irregular, his pulse thready, and he woke speaking in fragments of Latin and calling Humber by name. 2 attacks within a week, Vale concluded, his voice dropping, and both within that ill-named chamber. Sir Lionel's heir is a child abroad. If anything should happen to him— He faltered, then drew from his pocket a dull brass key upon a faded purple ribbon. This is for the inner library. I beg you will come, Mr. Holmes. There is something in that room that kills. Holmes turned the key between finger and thumb, his eyes half closed in that reptilian concentration that marks the onset of the hunt. When a man brings his house key to Baker Street, said he softly, it is either an act of trust or of despair. Very good. Watson, your coat and your service revolver, if you please. We will visit the Devil's Library before nightfall. As our cab rattled toward Charing Cross through streets thickening with the afternoon's commerce, Holmes leaned forward with that abrupt intensity that signals a question he has already half answered. You have left out something of importance, Mr. Vale. It concerns a book recently introduced to the collection. Vale started so violently that his hat brim struck the cab's frame. How in heaven's name? Your cuff tells me you have handled Blackmere's dust, Holmes murmured, examining Vale's sleeve as one might study a geological specimen. The grain is fine as onyx, an old friable soot that settles on the high shelves of a room seldom opened. But here and there I see brighter motes, like mica or gold dust. That is fresh disturbance. You have handled something new among the old, and handled it with interest sufficient to leave traces. Pray do not fence with me. We are about to walk into a room where men sit down and do not rise. Vale swallowed and looked out at the grey Thames as if it might absolve him. A parcel arrived last week from a dealer in Rome, a woman of uncertain reputation, but excellent connections, a volume bound in cracked black morocco, titled in Latin Malleus Tenebrarum, The Hammer of Shadows. My uncle, who is impressionable on certain points of theology, swore it smelt of brimstone. I ascribed that to damp hides and glue. Still, the villagers believe any mischance in the house touches that book. Holmes's eyes brightened with that swift inner light I had learned to associate with intellectual danger. He tucked the key into his pocket, and we went on to the train, in a silence broken only by the hiss of steam and the cry of vendors. If Kent is ever cheerful in winter, that day it made a studied exception. By the time we reached Blackmere, dusk pooled in the hedges like spilt ink, and the Priory's broken tower rose like a black finger against the dying light. The house proper had been grafted onto the ruin in the last century. Long Georgian windows, a new wing that did not match the old masonry, and in the central mass a pair of mullioned eyes, cautious and unblinking, that seemed to observe our approach with neither welcome nor reproach. We were admitted by a housekeeper, Mrs. Fenn, whose mouth had been trained by care and caution to close upon its own counsels. Her hands were red from work, her gaze steady, and she greeted Vale with a familiarity of long service and Holmes with the wariness of one who knows that detectives turn over stones better left undisturbed. In a drawing-room of good taste and questionable cheer, we met Mr. Carow, the family solicitor, a stout man with a watch chain that betokened caution, dinners, and an abiding faith in the solidity of legal precedent. He greeted us with the relief of one who welcomes any method that will move a dangerous matter out of his hands and into those better fitted for peril. "Sir Lionel sleeps," said Carow in a low voice, "but Dr. Willett attends him. You will wish to see the library before the light quite fails." Holmes did not answer immediately. His nostrils had flared, and his gaze moved about the hall with the restless precision of a hound testing the wind. "Watson," he murmured, as we followed Vale through a passage hung with sombre portraits. "Bitter almond. No, not precisely that. Some cousin to it. The house is steeped in a faint medicinal odour that a layman would call a liniment. We shall remember it." The library lay in two parts, an outer room with sober ranks of calf-bound volumes and a Gothic mantel carved with grapes and acanthus, and within it reached through a heavy oaken door by means of the brass key, the notorious inner chamber. This was a narrower place, with a barrel-vaulted roof of age-blackened oak and shelves that climbed to the arched ceiling. The air within was dry and peculiar, as though knowledge itself had been toasted there and turned to dust. A single tall window admitted the last grey light. On a central desk of a carved walnut, the black volume lay open upon a stand, its pages like wings arrested mid-flight. Its edges were gilded. The letters on the spine had lost their gold and peered through in blind brown. Holmes stood so still that the dust motes, drifting in the window's glow, seemed to take him for furniture. Then he moved, swift, sure, noiseless as a cat upon carpets. He peered at the floor, the skirting, the hinges of the window. He lifted the ivory paper knife by its extreme tip and held it to the lamp Mrs. Fenn had brought, turning it so that the light slid along the blade and handle. He touched the gilded edge of the volume with a slender glass rod from his pocket, and observed, with the detachment of a surgeon examining a wound, the faint smudge it acquired. At last he bent and sniffed at the book's foredge in several places, his lips compressed to a line. "Mr. Vale," he said at length, straightening, "who besides yourself has entered this inner room since Humber's death?" "Only Sir Lionel, on the morning he collapsed, and Dr. Willett when he was summoned. Though I confess Mrs. Fenn has the cleaning of it, and must dust when required." "Ah, and the key?" Vale coloured faintly. "It is kept on that ribbon in my study. Sir Lionel and I alone possess duplicates. The door is always locked when we are not present." "Quite." Holmes turned to me with a little nod, his signal that the first survey had confirmed whatever hypothesis marched in that singular brain. But he said nothing then. We left the inner room, and the door closed with a weighty courtesy, like a well-bred man keeping his secrets. In the corridor outside, Mrs. Fenn's lamp trembled slightly in her hand. "You'll forgive me, sir," she said to Holmes in a low voice, "but there's a feeling in that place. Books is books, no doubt, but some of them is no better than knives." Holmes gave her one of his rare, kind glances. "Knives cut both bread and fingers, Mrs. Fenn. It is the hand that wields them that concerns me, not the steel." We were shown to our chambers, adjoining rooms in the old wing, where the walls were thick and the windows narrow. I confess I carried to bed a sensation not wholly born of reason. The impression of a room that devoured breath, a book that had learned to wait, and a house that held its counsel too closely. Yet I slept at last, fitfully, and in sleep saw a deck of cards turned to pages, and pages turned to knives, while a thin hand, dusted with gold, reached out of the dark to close the book upon mine. When I woke to the grey dawn, the dream's unease clung to me still, and I rose with the certain knowledge that our work had only begun. Chapter 2. Witnesses and Fragments. We breakfasted with Vale and Mr. Carrow beneath a sober portrait of some Eversley ancestor whose frock looked as though it had been cut from the cloth of a thundercloud. Holmes's appetite is like his attention, either absent or surgical. That morning he consumed 2 eggs, a roll, and a pot of black coffee with an expression of profound detachment, as if his body had made a bargain with him not to intrude upon the operation of his mind. "Dr. Willett," said he, when the coffee had vanished and he had refused the marmalade. "A word with him before we visit Sir Lionel, if you please." Dr. Willett proved to be a little man with the complexion of a winter apple and the faith of a parish clerk in the remedies he prescribed. He met us in the morning room with the brisk assurance of a country practitioner who has seen gout, influenza, and rural melancholy, and considers them the sum of medical knowledge. "Exhaustion," said he firmly of Sir Lionel's collapse. "Nervous collapse brought on by grief and morbid fancy. Our gentleman has allowed the death of Mr. Humber to prey upon his mind. I found him cold to the touch, pulse irregular, 50 beats where it should be 70, and pupils somewhat dilated. I administered a grain of chloral hydrate and a restorative draught. He will do, though he must rest." "Dilated pupils," repeated Holmes with the air of a man filing a card in a mental index. "Very good. And Mr. Humber, you examined the body?" "I did. Found him seated at the desk, as Mr. Vale reported. No sign of violence, no mark upon the throat or face. Tongue unmarked, no odour of prussic acid or phosphorus. The pupils, well, I cannot swear to it. The light was failing, and the man had been dead some hours." The inquest returned the usual verdict. Holmes asked a dozen questions which appeared to me of minor bearing. The position of the chair, the angle of the lamp, whether the desk had been cleared by the servants before we arrived, or stood as found, what Humber had eaten that day, and whether the window had been open or shut. Willett answered with growing impatience, clearly deeming these inquiries the whims of a metropolitan theorist. Then we were shown in to Sir Lionel himself. The master of Blackmere lay amidst pillows in a chamber that smelt of beeswax, camphor, and the faint medicinal trace I had noted in the hall. His hair spread upon the linen like a white bird about his temples. He started when Holmes entered, and the fear in his eyes was a living thing, a thing I did not wish to see twice in the course of my profession. "It is not the book," he murmured in a voice like wind through straw, "but the hand behind the book." "Just so," said Holmes, taking the old man's wrist with a surgeon's delicacy. I observed him count the pulse, test the skin's warmth, and glance at the bedside table, where a clutter of bottles stood. "Courage, Sir Lionel. You have not lost your wits, only lent them to panic. How many in this house wish you well?" "All," he whispered. "All, save, perhaps, the one who does not. I am a man of peace, Mr. Holmes. The library is my last companion. Humber, good Humber, he would not have left me so, if he could have helped it." Holmes's glance flicked around the sick room, and paused upon a small, dark bottle stoppered with cork and labelled in a chemist's neat hand. He lifted it and read aloud. Tinct. Aconite, for external application. A liniment for neuralgia, he remarked to me. Aconite is a strange friend to keep upon one's bedside, though a common one. Dr. Willett bristled. Sir, the dose is minute and proper. It is tincture of aconite, as commonly compounded for rheumatic pain. Sir Lionel suffers from neuralgia in his joints at night. The cold affects him. Holmes replaced the bottle with an inscrutable expression. We will not quarrel over pharmacy, Doctor. Pray forgive me. He turned back to Sir Lionel and took his hand. I observe, sir, that your forefinger bears a roughened patch at the tip, as though the skin has been worn smooth by frequent use. You are in the habit of turning pages with it. I am, sir. I never could abide bookmarks or gloves. I must feel the vellum. Just so. And you moisten the finger? A faint flush touched the old man's cheek. A vile habit, I know. My wife used to scold me for it. Holmes released his hand gently. It is a habit shared by 9 readers in 10, Sir Lionel. You need not apologize. His eyes moved on, quick as swallows. Mr. Vale, you have been impatient to bring this business to an end, and you are not a patient man by nature. Still, you have done right to call me. Mr. Carrow, you know the state of the succession, I trust. Carrow coughed, a sound like a muffled bell. Sir Lionel's heir is his granddaughter, Miss Ada Eversley, presently travelling in Italy for her health. She is but 11 years of age. Mr. Vale is next of kin after the child. Holmes nodded, as if this were a remark about the weather. And Mrs. Fenn, he said, turning to the housekeeper, who had appeared in the doorway with the silent omniscience of her kind. You have the keys to all the cupboards, but not to ideas you do not like. Did Mr. Humber handle that black volume often? She folded her capable hands at her waist. Too often for my fancy, sir. He read of nights with the lamps turned low, and muttered to himself in languages I did not know. Still, a good gentleman, quiet as a mouse and grateful for his tea. And the day he died? I took him tea at 4 o'clock, as was my custom. He did not hear me come. So deep in his reading was he. The book lay open, and his finger was upon the page. At 6, Mr. Vale sent me back with a message. I knocked, got no answer, and entered. He was asleep as he sat, sir. Only he was not sleeping. Holmes's questions were without waste or ornament. He asked for the book's journey from Rome, who had received it, who unpacked it, who carried it across the 2 rooms, who first opened it and cut the leaves where they were uncut, as is common with old or privately printed works. I cut them, Vale confessed, his voice tight. Mr. Humber had urged me to leave such tasks to him, saying the gatherings were fragile. But my curiosity, well, I confess it overcame discretion. I used the paper knife there on the desk. With which instrument? Holmes indicated the ivory blade. Yes, there, but I assure you, I wiped it afterward upon a cloth. Of course you did, said Holmes simply. No man wishes to leave a tool dulled. We visited the inner room again in the strengthening morning light. The peculiar dryness and silence of the place were even more conspicuous now. The dust lay undisturbed save where our own feet had marked it the night before. I observed, upon Holmes's murmured hint, a faint difference of tone upon a strip of panelling near the north shelf, as though something had once hung there and lately been removed. He himself drew from the skirting with a pair of tweezers a tiny flake, which to my eyes was nothing, and from the cold hearth another, and from the gilded edges of the black book yet one more, each deposited with exactness on a white card that he produced like a conjurer, drawing a dove from air. He concluded his survey by looking long out of the narrow window upon the frost-bound lawn, where a faint track led from the side door, scarcely more than a softening of the hoar frost, where footsteps had troubled it. "Someone," he remarked, "has business in this wing before the household wakes." That evening, as the fog wrapped the priory so closely that the house seemed a ship adrift with no shore in sight, Holmes dispatched a note by the stable boy. "A trifling errand," he told me as he sealed it. "I must know whether a certain bookbinder on Ludgate Hill keeps late hours, and whether his memory is as keen as his needles." "You suspect the binder, then?" "I suspect the hand that orders binding," he returned, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "Humber is dead, Sir Lionel is frightened into illness, and a book sits open like a mouth. A book is not a murderer, Watson, but a book may be made to hold a murder the way a glass holds wine." As I banked the fire in our shared sitting-room, I reflected, not for the first time, that the interest of our calling lay not only in the detection of the hand, but in the illumination of the mind behind it, the architecture of motive, the mechanics of opportunity, the alchemy of fear. And somewhere in the house below, footsteps passed softly and were lost, as though the corridors themselves didn't approve of our intrusion and conspired to muffle what they knew. Chapter 3. The Red Stain and the Red Herrings. Morning brought with it an unexpected visitor, a woman of foreign aspect and indeterminate age, dressed with an elegance that wished to look careless. Her travelling cloak was of fine wool, her gloves of kid, and about her hung an air of having seen much and said little. She gave her card to Mrs. Fenn with the assumption that it would be honoured, and it bore the name Madame Lydia Sabo. Mr. Carrow would have sent her away, murmuring apologies about Sir Lionel's indisposition, but Holmes, who had been examining a smudge upon the window-sill with the aid of his pocket lens, interposed smoothly. "Let Madame speak," said he, straightening. "In the Devil's Library, conversation is a light as needful as any lamp." Madame Sabo laughed in a manner meant to show that she could afford to be amused by circumstance, and was above taking offence. She had, she explained in accented but polished English, long served as a guide for certain gentlemen of taste toward certain acquisitions, monkish parchments, penitential manuals, an exorcist's breviary from Prague. It was she who had offered the Malleus Tenebrarum to Sir Lionel through a Roman intermediary of mutual acquaintance. "I did not, of course," she added with a tilt of her head, "advise him to read it. Such books are for collectors, not scholars." Holmes regarded her hands, which were white, ringed, and very clean. "And you kept no copy of the text?" he asked lightly. "Of the text? My dear sir, one cannot copy smoke. The book is unique, or so the prior who sold it assured me." "Nor sell it twice," Holmes returned with a faint smile. "Your contribution is noted, madame. Pray forgive us if we decline to believe in demons until one agrees to be photographed for the Society for Psychical Research." She shrugged, a gesture at once graceful and dismissive, and took her leave, though not before glancing once, with what I thought was a calculation, toward the passage that led to the library. She left behind a cloud of perfume that could not entirely conceal a sharper scent of nervousness, like flowers laid over something less agreeable. Holmes's lip curled as the door closed. "She is a red herring," he said to Vale and myself. "A gleaming, expensive red herring, but still a fish. She profits from legend, not from death. Mark me. She will reappear in the newspapers as the woman who sold the cursed book, and her trade will double." We turned our attention then to the servants. Mrs. Fenn proved the firm pivot on which the household turned, discreet, observant, unshakably loyal to Sir Lionel. Of the others, the under-gardener had the good blank stare of honest labour and little imagination. The maid, Eliza, possessed the wary vivacity that gossips bring to church and kitchens. But it was the valet, Pike, who interested Holmes most. He was a man of middle height, with a closed face, and the knack of seeming to have been about to leave a room before one addressed him. His hands, when he clasped them, were oddly still. "Pike," said Holmes without preamble, "your boots tread softly. You oil them?" "A little, sir. It is my habit." "With what preparation?" Pike's eyes flickered, the first breach in his composure. "Whatever comes to hand, sir. A bit of neat's foot oil, or a liniment kept in Sir Lionel's room," Holmes finished. "The scent is distinctive." "Doctor, Willett leaves it there for the master's neuralgia, does he not?" "He does, sir." Pike's voice had gone flat. Holmes's gaze dropped to the man's hands. "You handle books when you dust the inner room." "Only to shift them when Mrs. Fenn says, sir." "I don't hold with them myself. Too much learning addles a man's wits." "An opinion shared by many," Holmes observed. "Thank you, Pike. That will be all." The valet withdrew with the silent efficiency of his kind, and Holmes stood for a moment gazing after him, his expression unreadable. We lunched unsociably. Holmes ate without tasting, his mind turned so entirely inward that one could almost see the air bow under the pressure of his thought. Afterward he demanded a horse from the stables and vanished into the fog, leaving me to make what small conversation I could with Mr. Carrow, who clung to his teacup as if the law were somewhere at the bottom of it and might be coaxed forth by faith. "A singular business," Carrow murmured. "I have drawn wills for 3 generations of Eversleys, Dr. Watson, and never has there been a breath of scandal. Now this. If Sir Lionel should die—" He did not finish the thought. It was dusk when Holmes returned, his cheeks whipped by cold and his eyes bright as a thoroughbred's after a gallop. "The bookbinder on Ludgate Hill remembers a private order," he said in clipped accents as he warmed his hands before the drawing-room fire. A set of uncut gatherings, the inner leaves of an old volume, he thought, to be gilt upon the edges with a certain gum, the recipe for which was provided by the customer. The binder, being a cautious man, made a note of the formula in case it damaged his tools. The customer wore kid gloves and paid in gold. The binder's apprentice, who has an eye for such things, recalls a signet ring upon the smallest finger and a scar, an old burn, he thought, upon the 3rd finger of the right hand. Vale coloured violently and stared at his own hand, which bore no scar. "You cannot mean to suggest—" "I can mean what the facts will carry," Holmes retorted, "and no more. But I observe that you flush, Mr. Vale, which suggests a guilty conscience or an innocent indignation. We shall discover which." He turned to me. "Watson, I require the inner library for an hour, undisturbed. Let no one enter until I call." He locked himself within. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no creak of wood, only the profound silence of a mind at work. When at last he emerged, his face had the chiselled look it wears when the quarry is cornered, though still at large. "Gentlemen," said he to us all when we gathered in the drawing-room at his request, "we dine together at 8. Afterward we will adjourn to the library. I beg that every person in the house be present, including Madame Sabo, if she will remain to see the denouement of a drama she assisted, though I think she did not author." "But, Mr. Holmes," protested Caro, "Sir Lionel is in no state. He shall be carried in his chair if he is able. If not, then only his empty chair and his bottle of liniment. It will suffice. The house must see this thing through together." That evening the fog gave up some of its moisture to the windows and made shining snails of the lamps. The household presented itself in a nervous assembly. Mrs. Fenn composed and pale, Pike self-effacing as only the very guilty or the quite guiltless can be, Eliza wide-eyed and anxious, Dr. Willett bristling with professional righteousness, Mr. Caro perspiring gently, Madame Zabo curious and faintly amused, and Jasper Vale with a high colour that flattered his cadaverous face. Sir Lionel, wrapped in a shawl, was supported by 2 footmen in his bath-chair, his eyes alert beneath the fear. Holmes drew the inner library door wide and stood aside. The black tome lay upon its stand, open as we had left it. He touched its gilded edge once, lightly, with the slender glass rod, and we all saw, even in that modest lamplight, a delicate sparkle, as of frost caught upon lace, or gold dust stirred by breath. "You see," said Holmes softly, "the Devil's Library is not haunted by spirits, but by chemistry." He said no more then, but his silence was not the end of things. It was their tightening, like the turn of a screw. We felt the case draw breath and prepare to speak, and in that moment I knew we stood upon the threshold of revelation. Chapter 4. The Experiment and the Mask. Holmes's experiments are always simple as a trap and as merciless. He set upon the desk 3 small white saucers, a strip of blotting paper, and a spirit lamp, from one of the bottle-strewn pockets of his coat, for he carries a portable laboratory about him, like a naturalist carries a collecting box. He produced a minute glass vial, colourless, which he placed beside the dark bottle of liniment from Sir Lionel's room. He turned to me with the brisk formality of a lecturer at Bart's. "Watson, oblige me. Touch the gilded edge of the book with the tip of your smallest finger, the lightest contact, and then touch the tip of your tongue." I obeyed, though not without misgiving. The gilt felt faintly tacky, as though it had not fully dried. A moment later, a tingling ran along my tongue and inner lip, such as one feels when snow is packed upon the skin too long, or when a dentist's cocaine solution is clumsily applied. It was not painful. Rather, it was intimate and unsettling, a numbness creeping at the edges. "Aconite," said Holmes quietly. "The old herbalists call it monkshood or wolf's bane. Our friend Dr. Willett keeps a dilute tincture here for legitimate use, a common enough remedy for neuralgia when applied externally in proper measure. But someone has painted a stronger preparation, prepared, I believe, with an oily gum and a quantity of gold powder along this book's edges. The gilding supplies the glitter that lures the eye and the medium that carries the poison. The reader supplies the final mechanism by his most innocent habit. He moistens his finger to turn the page." A shudder passed through the little company. Dr. Willett sputtered, his apple cheeks darkening. "I protest. This is monstrous. My tincture is prescribed, labelled Locked! Monstrous, yes, Holmes cut in, and yet of a most practical ingenuity. With aconitine, the active principle of aconite, a very small exposure smarts the mouth and causes tingling. More produces numbness, dilated pupils, irregular pulse, coldness of the extremities, and, if the dose mounts through repeated contact, respiratory failure. Mr. Humber was elderly and sat long within a still dry room. Such a man will lick his finger more often than he knows, especially when the pages are stiff with age. Sir Lionel, already weakened by grief and primed by the same habit, was easily pushed toward collapse by a lesser dose. Observe quote. He bent the lamp's flame close to the book's foredge, and in the stronger light we could see faint streaks upon the gilding, regular, minute, and with a sheen subtly different from the old gold beneath. These marks are recent, Holmes continued. The villain refreshed his trap, likely after Humber's death, to ensure Sir Lionel would follow. The method is elegant. It requires no force, no struggle, no witness. The poison does its work slowly, and the victim obligingly administers it to himself. He now took up the ivory paper knife between finger and thumb, and held it to the lamplight. The knife was used by Mr. Vale to cut the unopened gatherings when the book first arrived. Watson, the magnifying glass, if you please. I handed it to him. He examined the handle with minute care, tilting it so that the carved scrollwork caught the light. Here, in this crack of the ivory, one can see a trace of the same oily compound. It would not surprise me if Mr. Vale, eager to explore his new prize, inadvertently smeared the mixture there when he cut the leaves. The gum would have been fresh then, sticky. A man does not think to wipe a paper knife as carefully as he might a dinner knife. Vale's face had become a study in misery. Great heavens, Holmes, if what you say is true, then I have been the instrument. I handled that book. I cut those pages. You are guilty of curiosity, Mr. Vale, not of murder, Holmes said, and for the first time his voice softened with something like pity. But the murderer stands where we can see him. He is accustomed to this room. He knows what will and will not be observed. He has access to Sir Lionel's liniment as a model and a source, to the bookbinder as an instrument, and to fear as his ally. He is methodical. And finally, he has a scar upon the third finger of his right hand. Holmes's gaze moved slowly, deliberately, along the row of faces. Hands lifted, or were tucked away. Mrs. Fenn's work roughened, Caro's ink-stained, Willet's plump and clean. It came to rest upon Pike, the valet, who stood very still with his hands clasped before him, as a man might stand at a funeral. "Show me your hands, Pike." Pike's wooden face didn't change, but his eyes flickered once, toward the door, toward Vale, then down. Slowly, as if the air had thickened to treacle, he extended his right hand. There, at the base of the third finger, an old pale sliver of a wound crossed the knuckle. "A burn," he muttered, "from a kettle, years ago." "From a crucible," Holmes returned evenly. "You dabble in more than boot polish, Pike. You placed the poison. When Mr. Humber died, you were among the first summoned to assist in moving the body. You had opportunity then to refresh the gilding, to smear the knife anew, and to present an appearance of zeal and shock. You were also the man seen by the under-gardener, trudging at dawn to the side door these 2 mornings running, when the frost preserved your comings and goings. The track is faint, but it is there, and it leads from the servants' quarters to the library wing. But you are no chemist, Pike. Your compound is crude, your method unsubtle. You had a tutor. Holmes's eyes moved, fox-swift, to Jasper Vale. "No," Vale cried, rising half out of his chair. "You wrong me, Holmes. I would never." But his gaze darted, not to Holmes, but to the little dark bottle on the tray, and then to his own dust-filmed cuffs, as if they might betray him. "Do I wrong you?" Holmes's voice was cool as rain on glass. "Let us examine what we know. You ordered the bookbinder to re-gild the edges of the Malleus Tenebrarum, the binder whose apprentice recognized your signet ring and noted your gloves and your manner of payment. You are a scholar. You knew the habit of readers, the moistened finger, the long hours, the intimate contact between hand and page. You wear the dust of Blackmere like laurels, for you are proud of that library and resent any interloper. You are heir presumptive after the child. Humber's death would thrust the catalogue back into your hands and remove a rival for your uncle's affection. The book gave you both a stage and a mask. Pike provided access and opportunity. Madame Zabo, unwittingly, provided legend. But the will, the will was the heart of the matter. Mr. Carow emitted a strangled noise. Holmes crossed to the panel where I had noticed the faint rectangle of discoloration. He pressed upon a carved rose in the wainscoting, and by some trick of 18th century carpentry, or by patient observation of how dust settles differently on hinges, the wood sighed open like a confessional. Within lay a shallow cavity, and in it a folded parchment whose seal had been recently broken and nastily reclosed with a daub of wax that did not match the original. Holmes laid the document upon the desk with the care one might give a serpent. "The codicil," he said, naming Miss Ada Eversley as sole heir and securing her guardianship, not to Mr. Vale, who would have expected the duty, but to Mr. Carow, with an independent trustee from London. You discovered this, Jasper, when you used your key to search the inner room. Perhaps you meant only to examine it. Perhaps you thought to alter it, or destroy it and plead ignorance. But your courage failed, or your cunning told you that a missing codicil would direct suspicion toward you more surely than a living one. Meanwhile, if Sir Lionel could be made to follow Humber, who would question a double tragedy in a room the village already called accursed, you would return to London with every sympathy. The codicil would surface in probate, and you would contest it as the grief-stricken cousin, swearing your uncle's mind had been disturbed by morbid fancy. Vale's shoulders sank. His face had gone grey as the fog outside. "It is all fantastical," he murmured, but his voice carried no conviction. "You have a genius for theatre, Mr. Holmes, but not for proof. Allow me one last demonstration." Holmes's weariness was palpable now, as though the unmasking had cost him something he would not name. He took a pinch of the substance from the card where he had collected it, dissolved it in one of the saucers with a drop of spirits, and dipped the blotting paper into the solution. This he held near the spirit lamp's flame. For a moment nothing happened. Then a faint violet suggestion wavered in the air above the paper, like a bruise upon light itself. Aconitine, gentlemen, responds to heat with a characteristic colour, a test known to toxicologists since the work of Christison. And here, he touched Vale's right cuff with the tip of a needle and transferred the smallest hint of shine to a fresh card. "Is the gum you compounded, or caused to be compounded, a mixture of gilder's size, linseed oil, and pine resin, married to the tincture of aconite. The gum is common enough in a bookbinder's workshop. The proportion requires both taste and risk. It bears your mark, mister. Vale, that itch for a short way round a long labour. You could not wait for nature to take Sir Lionel, nor for the law to settle the succession. You made a trap of the thing you loved, a library, and baited it with the thing your uncle loved, a book. For a long moment no one moved. Then Pike lunged, not toward the door, but toward Vale, his face twisted with a fury I had not thought him capable of. "You said it was harmless," he shouted. "You said it would only make the old man sleep, that he'd wake and think the room was cursed, and we'd be rid of the place and the books and the whole damned—" 2 footmen seized him. He struggled, then subsided, panting. Vale had not moved. He sat as if the air had thickened to amber around him, his eyes fixed on the black book that had been his instrument and his undoing. Mrs. Fenn crossed herself once, not as a Catholic, but as a woman who has seen something she will not speak of when the lamps are out. Sir Lionel, in his chair, had closed his eyes, and I could not tell whether he wept or merely wished to shut out the sight of his kinsman's ruin. And in that grim, cold room that had been named for the devil, the trap stood open at last for all to see, elegant as a sword stick and twice as mean. Holmes had spoken of chemistry, but I saw in that moment something older, the alchemy of greed transforming knowledge into poison, and love of books into a love of what books might buy. The worst of the fog pressed at the narrow window, but within there was a very human clarity, bitter as the taste still tingling on my tongue. Chapter 5. The hand behind the book. The remainder of that long evening passed with a certain sombre efficiency that I have observed attends the conclusion of such matters. Holmes sent a footman to the village for the local constable, a stolid man named Bullen, who arrived smelling of pipe tobacco and righteousness, and wrote 2 notes, one to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, and one to an apothecary of his acquaintance in Canterbury, requesting the loan of certain chemical tests for the formal inquest. Pike confessed first in a sullen torrent, claiming he had believed Vale's assurances that the mixture was only meant to cause drowsiness and superstitious dread, not death. Whether this was true or the self-deception of a weak man seeking to halve his guilt, I couldn't say. Vale, for his part, maintained a frightened civility that might have deceived a country curate, but could not deceive a man who had seen, as Holmes and I had seen, the long catalogue of human frailty. He admitted nothing directly, yet his silences were admissions enough. When Constable Bullen produced handcuffs, heavy, old-fashioned things that clanked like irons from a dungeon, Vale flinched as though the metal burned. "I meant no murder," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I meant only to frighten, to make the room seem dangerous, to persuade my uncle to sell the collection and leave this place. He is old. He has no heir but a child abroad. Was it so wicked to wish for what would one day be mine in any case?" "It was wicked," said Holmes quietly, "when you made a means of poison and called it persuasion. The first death you might lay at mischance's door. The second reveals intent. You refreshed the trap, Mr. Vale. You knew what it would do." Vale said nothing more. They took him and Pike away into the fog, and the house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath since the night Humber died. Holmes sat with Sir Lionel in the sick-room for a quarter of an hour, and I heard through the half-open door a voice gentled by practice, telling the old man as much as would steady him, without doing further harm. "You have enemies only because you have property, Sir Lionel," Holmes said. "It is a vulgar fate, but not a unique one. Your library is safe now. Let it be catalogued by men you trust, or let it be given to an institution that will care for it as you have done." Sir Lionel gripped his hand. I saw the old fingers, knotted with age and pain, close on Holmes's with surprising strength. "The Black Book," he whispered. "Seal it. Give it to a museum that will lock it from men as if it had fangs." "Or burn it," Mrs. Fenn muttered from the doorway, her arms folded across her chest. "There's no learning in a thing turned wicked." "Perhaps both," Holmes said diplomatically. "The police will need it for evidence, but after that, well, a book that has killed twice has earned its pyre." When at last we sat once more alone in the inner room, the constable having posted a man at the door and forbidden entry save to ourselves, Holmes closed the Malleus Tenebrarum with a certain finality and slipped a folded paper under its cover. It bore, in his swift angular hand, a warning to the police. "Do not touch the gilt edges. Treat as evidence of poisoning. Suggest tongs and waxed paper." He then replaced the codicil in its niche and turned the panel shut with the tips of his fingers, leaving no smudge. "You will ask me," he said, leaning against the desk and lighting his pipe, "why Vale did not administer a simpler poison in a simpler glass, arsenic in the port, or morphine in the bedtime draught." The thought had occurred to me. Vanity, Watson. He wished the library itself to seem to kill. He wished to be the man who understood the devil and could make it dance to his tune. He fancied himself the master of dark knowledge, when in truth he was only a shabby poisoner with a flair for the theatrical. He forgot that devils are clumsy dancers with large feet, and that dust records every step. And Pike? A tool. Implements must be paid, and Pike saw in Vale's scheme a chance to profit, perhaps even to inherit a small reward if the plan succeeded. Mark his boots, oiled with the very liniment he used to compound the poison, the scent everywhere, like a confession written in perfume. Even his alibi, that he was attending to the fires at dawn, smells false. He was attending to his trap. We departed Blackmere the following noon, the fog having lifted at last, to reveal a winter landscape of pewter and bone. The Priory's tower looked merely ruined now, rather than watchful, a remnant of something older and perhaps more innocent than the house grafted onto it. Dr. Willett, chastened by the revelation that his liniment had been turned to murder, pressed upon me a bottle of tonic and a stammered apology. Mr. Carow, already composing the legal instruments that would secure Miss Ada's inheritance, shook Holmes's hand with the fervour of a man who has seen the law vindicated by wit. At the door, Mrs. Fenn pressed a paper parcel into my hands. It contained a jar of quince marmalade, golden and fragrant. "You and your friend are a light in a bad winter, sir," she said, and though she addressed me, I knew the compliment was meant for Holmes, whom she could not quite bring herself to thank directly, as if gratitude for such dark work were itself a kind of admission. In the train, Holmes stretched long in his corner seat and lit his pipe, watching the Kent fields roll past, bare hedgerows, frost-rimed furrows, the occasional oast house standing like a witch's hat against the pale sky. The great engines beat out a solemn rhythm. London approached like a thought one has been avoiding, and must at last entertain. "You see, Watson," he said at last, breaking a silence that had lasted since Charing Cross, "that men manufacture their own demons. A room of books is no more dangerous than a field of wheat until a hand alters it. Vale created his devil's library as surely as if he had built it stone by stone." "I shall never wet my finger at a page again," I said with feeling. "Good. It is an unsanitary habit in any case." He smiled faintly. "Besides, the best books are those that turn themselves, the ones that compel you forward without any need for hurrying." I thought of the black volume, waiting now in an evidence room for the inquest, its gilded edges glittering with murder. I thought of Humber, dead at his desk with knowledge on his tongue, and of Sir Lionel, waking in fragments of Latin and fear. And I thought of Vale, who had loved books so much that he had made one of them a weapon, not against ignorance, but against life itself. "Mrs. Fenn said that some books are no better than knives," I remarked. "She is wiser than she knows," Holmes replied. "But I would amend it thus. In the hands of fools, even knives are more honest than books. A knife shows its edge. A book may hide poison between its pages, and call it learning." The train carried us onward through the gathering dusk. The gaslights of London began to prick the horizon like scattered stars, and the great sooty embrace of the city, chaotic, indifferent, alive, opened to receive us. Behind us, Blackmere Priory settled back into its silence, and the Devil's Library stood empty at last, waiting for the spring when Sir Lionel, if he lived, might open its doors again to the light. Thus concluded the affair of the Devil's Library, in which poison passed as learning, learning passed as terror, and terror was at last reduced to method. I keep Mrs. Fenn's marmalade still, though it has long since been eaten. The jar stands on my shelf beside my service revolver and my Afghan campaign medal, 3 relics of 3 different wars. Whenever I open an old volume now, I am careful. The scent of age and leather is not so different from the scent of certain medicines, and a man must trust his wits more than his nerves. But I am grateful, too, for what Holmes taught me in that cold room, that the greatest mysteries are not those we read about, but those we allow ourselves to believe without proof, and that the hand behind the book is always more dangerous than the book itself. There are cases that close like a door, and others that fade like breath upon a pane. This one, with its glittering edges and its quiet malice, did a little of both. The newspapers liked the phrase "Devil's Library," and so the public were satisfied that superstition had been lifted like a mask to reveal a face they already understood. Greed. Yet I cannot forget the light in Holmes's eyes as he lifted his glass rod to the gilding, nor the delicate tremor that ran through a room when reason first took hold of it. Holmes stood that night by our window at Baker Street and said, not to me, but to the fog beyond, that men will always contrive to make old fears do new work. But, he added, so will we. It was as much a vow as a verdict. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning and beware the fog.